It's the new frontier of the legal fight for the rights of LGBT Americans. This is Beyond Politics. I'm former Congressman Paul Hodes with my co-host, Matt Robison. There's been no area of American life that's seen a more profound shift in recent decades than in our cultural and legal recognition of the rights of LGBTQ people. As remarkable as that's been, there's also an emerging set of questions where there's less consensus and where Americans seem to be struggling to figure out the right path forward. To walk us through the victories and the road ahead, we are really privileged to have Kevin Jennings, the CEO of Lambda Legal, the nation's oldest and largest nonprofit legal advocate for LGBTQ plus individuals and those living with HIV/AIDS. Kevin, welcome to Beyond Politics.
Thank you very much, Congressman.
People may have heard of Lambda Legal, but may not be familiar with what is a truly fascinating origin story in early history.
Lambda Legal was formed in 1973, and when we applied to be a charity with the state of New York, the state literally turned us down, saying that there was, first of all, no need for our work, even though at that point in America, being gay was illegal in 43 states, and that our purpose was neither benevolent nor charitable. So we had to be our own first client, and we had to sue for our very right to exist. And we succeeded, and were incorporated on October 18th, 1973. So we've just had our 50th birthday. It's really amazing for when I talk to young people, for when I have to explain that being in a gay relationship was actually a crime in this country when Lambda Legal was founded in 43 states. We fought until Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, but that in the 21st century, there were still 16 states that criminalized same-sex relationships. That blows the mind of young people I talk to. They think those laws were gotten rid of in the 1700s.
Right.
But they were still on, and they actually are still on the books, but they've been invalidated by Lawrence versus Texas. And the first state to pass a law banning discrimination on sexual orientation in employment was not until 1982. Just so your listeners know, we operate the only national legal help desk for people who've experienced discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or HIV status, which you can either file a report at lambdalegal.org/helpdesk, or you can call 1-833-I-SAY-GAY. And an attorney will get back to you and provide you support and options for what you can do. We take about 5,000 calls a year, believe it or not, for people who are still experiencing discrimination based on those identity characteristics. And in fact, the number one thing that we hear they're discriminated against is in employment. So even though we made it illegal at the Supreme Court, it is still something that's happening every day in America.
I'm just struck as you describe how big the mental gap is for younger people to try to bridge, to understand the state of things before they were born. I was having a conversation with my daughter, who's 12, yesterday. She has a dear friend who identifies as they, them. The friend is dating someone who now identifies as male, previously identified as female. And my daughter's question is, should I refer to the significant other / partner as the boyfriend or the girlfriend or what? The very fact that these are the kinds of conversations I have as a parent now, compared to the history that you just described, is absolutely remarkable. Speaking of that rapid and incredible evolution, we interviewed Sasha Eisenberg on this show. He's the author of The Engagement, which is a comprehensive history of the struggle for marriage equality. It's a remarkable book. It was a remarkable interview. I urge people to check it out in the feed. And he made a very persuasive case that very few people, not just in the equality movement, but specifically in the legal community, especially Lambda, that focuses on equal rights, thought that marriage equality was an attainable goal. When you think back to that time, were there people who had any inkling of what the next 10 and 20 years would look like, both culturally and legally?
There was an early attorney at Lambda Legal who was the first director of our marriage project, named Evan Wolfson. Evan Wolfson had written his law school thesis in 19 on the need for same-sex marriage. And he kept at it for 42 years until he got it in 2015. There were visionaries like Evan who thought it was possible, and I'm going to admit publicly, I was not one of them. When Evan came to meet with me to discuss his plans to push same-sex marriage in the mid-90s, My first reaction was, that's very nice, Evan. That's not going to happen in our lifetime.
Hmm.
But good luck with that. And I have never been happier to be completely wrong in my life. That idea came up in the Obergefell argument in 2015, and the legendary Ruth Bader Ginsburg dismissed civil unions as skim milk marriage. When Lambda Legal filed its first lawsuits around marriage equality in the mid 90s, impossible to imagine that we would win 20 years later. After all, only 24% of Americans in 1995 supported marriage equality. Today, it's well over 70%. So the world has changed, but it's changed because we've made it change.
In the 2000s, there's almost nothing like it in the history of polling. I mean, 2-1 against marriage equality became 2-1 for it in what felt like an eye blink. It seemed like an eye blink. For me, serving in Congress, how did you experience it? Could you believe it?
No. And thank God people like Evan Wilson and Lambda Legal's current director of litigation, Camilla Taylor, ignored me. Camilla came up with the idea that we should go to Iowa and sue for marriage equality in Iowa in 2008. And I was like, you are out of your mind. Iowa? But she was right, and she won. And that really was the first domino to fall. Like the Massachusetts victory in 2004 was absolutely gigantic. But if there was a place that you thought gays might be allowed to get married, Massachusetts would probably be high on your list. Iowa was not high on anyone's list. But Camilla thought it could happen, and she made it happen. And in fact, we do have our own podcast, Making the Case for Equality at Lambda Legal. And there's a whole episode with Camilla where she talks about the improbable win in Iowa in 2008. So I remained amazed as the Lambda Legal attorneys and the attorneys at the ACLU and at GLAAD in Boston kept rolling out these cases and kept winning. They were right, and I was wrong. And I'll be getting married next year as a result of their vision.
Mazel tov.
Yes, congratulations.
So, thank you. And, quite honestly, growing up as a little boy in North Carolina in the 1970s, this was ludicrous to me. But Paul, you raised an interesting point. Studies have shown that the number one way to reduce prejudice towards LGBT people is to know someone personally who's LGBT. And one of the unintended consequences of AIDS was that America came to know gay people because people really couldn't be in the closet anymore. They were getting sick. They were dying. Everyone came to know primarily gay men as a result of the horror of AIDS. And I actually think in a weird way, AIDS paved the way for marriage equality. Now, what we're finding right now is a backlash, particularly against trans people. And Matt, two things in response to what you said earlier. First of all, the Gallup organization did a poll last year, and they found that 20% of Generation Z identifies as LGBT. 20%. The greatest generation, people in their 80s, 90s, by the way, it's less than 1%. Now, is there something in the water? No. What's happening as the next generation is becoming more and more accepting, more and more people are feeling free to be who they are, like your child's friends. So that's great. And it's very needed because over 70% of Americans say they've never met a trans person. Now, they probably have, they just didn't know, but they think they've never met a trans person. And when someone is a mystery to you, it's easy to fall for misinformation and, frankly, lies, which is what our opponents are spreading about trans people. And it's why this year almost 600 anti-LGBTQ plus bills were introduced into 47 state legislatures. 80% of them attack trans people specifically, and over 80 of them have been enacted into law in 22 states. And Lambda Legal now is really the community's last line of defense. We are litigating in 29 states trying to hold back this tide of hateful legislation because the only hope we have left is, can Lambda Legal strike it down in court? And that's what we're trying to do nationwide.
First of all, congratulations on your upcoming wedding. It's, Paul, I think back to our rabbi back in Concord, who is, here's a remarkable story too. A woman rabbi, the cantor is her wife and also a woman. And she tells the story that they had a commitment ceremony, a civil union. Therefore, they had previously been committed, civilized, and unionized, but never married. So the fact that you're able to get married, again, it's just, It's delightful. And yet, I'm glad you went there on the polling, because we recently interviewed Dr. Daniel Cox, who's the director of the Center on American Life at the American Enterprise Institute. Here's what he's written. Last month, Gallup recorded, as you alluded to, Kevin, a substantial drop in the number of Americans who believe that, quote, gay or lesbian relations are morally acceptable. The 2023 poll found that just shy of 2/3, 64% of Americans believe same-sex relationships are morally acceptable, a 7-point drop from the previous year. That's a significant reversal of a long-running upward trajectory over the last 20 years. It wasn't that long ago, 2002, we were alluding to this a moment ago, that only 38% of Americans, only 38% believed same-sex relationships were morally acceptable. Much of this recent decline was driven by Republicans, but not entirely. Our subsequent conversation on the show was about the fact that it seems like, and this is what Dr. Cox, I think, is sort of arguing in his writing, it seems like as Americans have encountered a new set of issues, as you say, associated with transgender rights, they are finding it harder to navigate. They're finding it harder to wade through and sort of understand and find their way toward, well, what is the principle of equality that we need to uphold here? What is the sense of rights? It became so clear cut around the issue of marriage. It became something that, as you say, as people got to know and feel comfortable with more gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender neighbors and friends, they began to feel like, wow, of course my friend should be able to get married. Duh. They're not quite there on trans issues. That seems to be what's happening. What's your sense of it? What are you experiencing from the legal end of it in terms of what's going on, what we're seeing in these polling numbers?
Well, there's so many, you raise a really important point, and there's so many complex. But I think if we were to sum it up, it really comes down to the fact that America doesn't know trans and non-binary people. Like I said, over 70% of Americans say they've never met a trans or non-binary person. And that skews very much based on age. People like your daughter, they know trans people. People my age who are 60, most of them don't. And of course, your daughter's not voting, and people my age are. So politicians play to that. I think in the end, this will go the same route that same-sex marriage did, because I wrote a book on LGBT history 30 years ago, and I said there's two laws of LGBT history. Law one is the more visible we are, the more we get attacked. Law two is the more we are attacked, the more we organize and fight back and make progress. And we're starting to see law two kick in right now, because more and more trans people are coming out. People are starting, there's been a significant change over the last 10 years in the number of people who say they know trans people. And as that change continues, and as your daughter becomes a voter, these appeals to bigotry will be less and less effective. But right now they're working because people are unaware of the trans people in their lives. And there's a second thing that's going on that I think is really insidious and really dangerous. And we're all old enough to remember a woman named Anita Bryant, who launched a campaign in the 70s called Save Our Children, which basically said, gay people are after your kids, don't protect their rights. Now, the reason why, and now we're hearing that being reborn today with talk of groomers, that LGBT people are grooming young people to be LGBT, which I just find hilarious. The idea that somebody would watch RuPaul's Drag Race and decide I'd like to be trans. It's like, the program's good, but it ain't that good. Throughout history, the best way to marginalize a group of people is to say they're after your kids. Supposedly Jews drank the blood of Christian children, and this justified pogroms. Supposedly Black men were after little white girls, and this justified lynching. Supposedly the Roma stole children, and that's why they were also put in camps during the Holocaust. And LGBT people historically have been accused of being pedophiles, recruiters. We're after your kids. Now, you have a kid, so you understand that if you think somebody's going to hurt your kid, you probably become pretty irrational pretty fast, because every parent wants their kid to be safe. The reason why they're trotting this tired out is because it works. People want kids to be safe.
I can tell you as a father that I feel much safer with my kids at a drag brunch than I would at, let's say, like a Fox News convention. Well, congratulations again. And thanks so much for being with us on Beyond Politics.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us on and for the important work you're doing.